Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic Focus channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and have also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see. The Third World War was going on for almost 5 years. At most fronts, there was no particular progress, though fatigue was starting to set in. In South America, where the battles were slow and sluggish, but mostly in the favor of the Americans and NATO forces, a counterattack by Brazil had resulted in the forces to the south being pushed back. Opposing forces used guerrilla war tactics as always, meaning that most confrontations in the jungle ended up in a loss for the invaders. The battles at Turkey were at a standstill ever since first contact. Morale was low with many soldiers as they did not see any progress in the actions they did. But in the past year, one of the generals mentioned that even though no advancements could be made, it was only a matter of time before the Turkish armies would be reduced to where they could properly invade the nation. And indeed, surveying enemy intel did suggest that the Turkish fighting force was being reduced at a rapid rate, with each artillery barrage and beach assault. It was like chipping away at a giant statue with a small hammer. It would take blood, sweat, and tears, but eventually, the stone giant would fall. Besides the Turkish having suffered a lot of deaths in this war on Shanghai Pact, it was North Korea that suffered too. Though they did still hold Seoul, they had lost almost 250,000 men, while their opponent, South Korea, only lost a fraction of that. Many Chinese that were stationed at Seoul had suffered the same fate, with NATO forces bombarding the city day in, day out. The opposition used drones to hunt the soldiers that were hunkered down. And so as the world turned to 2027 and World War III had raged on with little to no progress when it came to shiftings at front lines, that was all about to change, with a lengthy war now taking its toll on morale and supplies. Despite faltering fighting forces in Turkey, the front line still held in their favor, due to reinforcements being provided by other countries and volunteers. At the Korean front, nothing much changed as well. There were attacks planned every other week to bypass the capital city and flank them, but the Chinese forces were mostly dominant in those areas and would not let up. Earlier rumors regarding the Russian faction talking politics with Myanmar and requesting they would join their team had indeed resulted in just that. Now Russia's choking grip was even further around China's neck, but Putin still did not show any intent of getting involved with this matter. There were some who believed that these political moves were made in the hope that China would make a mistake and make the first move, to which Russia would then respond and declare war in a means of self-defense. In the fall of 2027, the NATO forces finally had a major breakthrough in Turkey, and one that in their eyes was impossible to lose to the Shanghai Pact again. Their enemies were now divided at west and east fronts, to which the ones at the west were cut off by the sea and the NATO army. They were sitting ducks, and every general from every nation involved in the battle ordered the remaining opposing forces to be crushed. The media called it the modern Dunkirk. Nations from all over the globe were involved with these fights, and the breakthrough that so many people had been waiting for felt like a breath of relief in online articles and news videos. The breakthrough force had not cut off the units in the west completely yet though, and to the north still stood a quite powerful army consisting of remaining Turkish elite soldiers and Russian volunteers. They were heavily outnumbered and surrounded. The victory would surely go to the NATO soldiers, but they would not go down without a fight, and this particular battle would be known throughout history as the Bloody Gulch. In America, the war suddenly came a bit too close to home for many. With setback after setback in South America, it came as a shock that a small Navy battle was held in their own waters. Now, the battle resulted in the American ships sinking the Brazilian ones, but it had many people worried that the battles were being fought right on their doorstep. The armies fighting for NATO in Brazil had indeed been pulled all the way back, but were not entirely eradicated. The towns and cities they held still under control, they had locked down good. Slowly new reinforcements were coming in, and the plan was to launch a counterattack so massive that it would put fear in every Brazilian's heart. But the Brazilians do not retreat that easily. This was their country, their home. By November of 2027, the modern Dunkirk was official. Tens of thousands of military units were cut off, and many died each day as opposing forces closed in more and more on them. Some expected outrage from countries like Russia or India that had lost some of their sons and daughters due to volunteers heading over there. But more often than not, they were shunned for being stupid to head to another country and fight another man's war. They lacked patriotism in many people's eyes. In South America, the counterattack by the US forces finally happened, but it did not come from the south as some expected. Instead, new beach landings were planned, and much like D-Day invasions in the Pacific back in World War II, the soldiers had to fight their way up to the beach and into the jungles. Intel showed that Turkey was about to collapse. The loss of territory fueled the hearts of the most battle-hardened soldiers, but many believed their resistance to the invader to be in vain. A massive and solid front had been established to the west, and they were now about to steamroll east, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. The news of the successful push into Turkey had also reached the NATO forces that were active in South America. Despite the miserable circumstances in which they fought, it gave a little bit of hope to the soldiers' fighting spirits, and some higher-ups were inspired to use the occurrence in speeches to rally the troops to work harder at this front as well. Despite establishing a very secure front, the following weeks would be bloody warfare all over Turkey, with most of the casualties falling at the Shanghai Pact's side. With NATO units pushing from north and the central east, the army stationed south also relaunched a war campaign to take back ground they had lost over the past couple of months. 3 months later, almost half of Turkey had been secured by NATO. Many temporary bases and facilities were erected in the name of NATO to resupply the front as quickly as possible. In Korea, the situation had been the same for years. The nickname for the war there was the Internal War, but soldiers stationed in Turkey found that ridiculous, since many of them had experienced what it was like during all those years with the front not moving an inch firsthand. Halfway through 2028, more than half of Turkey had been conquered, and victory for NATO was imminent. By now, the battles waged were also gravely in the favor of the armies fighting for NATO, as all who resisted were severely understaffed and under-equipped. The Blue forces steamrolled over their enemies, and the capitulation by Turkey was expected before the year would be over. The South Korean seas were also patrolled by the US fleets, which at the same time sent over manpower to fight alongside their Korean comrades. In general, the Korean forces did not suffer that many losses during the battles despite the fierceness of them. Long-distance artillery and drones were still the norm on their side. It were the North Koreans that were doing the bleeding. The South Korean soldiers got along well with the American ones. With the stalemate that went on for years, it was freeing to see new faces join their forces. Even if the results of the battles did not change that much, it was still a great feeling to exchange new stories and hear new perspectives from outside. By now, a considerable force outside of the Americans had joined the assaults in South America. Prominent forces were from Canada, France, and Israel, but other nations had sent in several thousands of troops as well. With much of the jungles being destroyed in the bombings and raids, the infantry would often fight their battles in fields of ash and smoke. Turkey was holding on to its last breath. Every day, more and more soldiers fighting for the Shanghai Pact surrendered, while others crossed the border to neighboring nations in the hope to fight again another day. But with a new capital in enemy hands as well, the Turkish higher-ups had no other choice but to capitulate. It was official. Turkey had fallen and was now under the control of NATO. It was the first major victory for the NATO forces, and in their eyes, a sign of what was to come. The war was far from over, but after 6 years of bloodshed, The first major obstacle had been traversed.